top 25 natural health sites in the world, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Your Personal Paleo Code. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Orlando. Happy to be here.
So, for a little background first, you were inspired to start this kind of work by your own experience in your 20s.
That's right. I was traveling around the world and I got sick with amoebic dysentery and parasites. And although I recovered pretty quickly from that initial episode, the post-infectious consequences of that evolved into a decade-long journey back to health. And that's really what's informed my commitment to this work and also my perspective and approach.
Cool. So you tried to get over those things with the traditional doctors and everything, but you found that didn't work for you.
Yeah, conventional medicine is really excellent when it comes to trauma and emergency and acute care. So if I get hit by a bus, I definitely want to go to the hospital. We're starting to be able to restore sight to the blind and reattach limbs and maybe even fight cancer with nanorobots at some point in our lifetime. So there's some pretty cool stuff that we can do with conventional medicine. But the key thing to understand is that it's not effective for treating chronic disease, and chronic disease is our biggest problem by far. Now, 1 of 2 Americans now suffers from a chronic disease. 1 in 4 have more than one chronic disease. And our medical model evolved at a time when the top 3 causes of death were all acute infectious diseases like pneumonia and typhoid. Today, 7 of the top 10 causes of death are chronic diseases. So we're really in a different environment, and the medical model that we have is not deal with that challenge.
Right. So in that same aspect today, we think about, our traditional healthcare system, and then we have organizations like the American Heart Association. And unless you're living under a rock and you're in the health industry, you might have heard about some bad things about coconut oil.
Yeah. So American Heart Association, as many people know, has been banging this drum for 50 years, really, at this point. They've insisted that cholesterol in the diet is harmful and contributes to the risk of cardiovascular disease. And they've said the same thing about saturated fat. Now, interestingly enough, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of this as well. Last year, for the first time ever, the United States removed the restriction on dietary cholesterol from their dietary guidelines. So in other words, they basically admitted that there isn't enough research to support the idea that eating cholesterol in the diet has any impact at all, not only on your blood cholesterol levels, but more importantly, risk of heart disease. So they kind of, in a low profile way, came out and admitted that what they've been telling us for the last 50 years was false. Unfortunately, they haven't done that with saturated fat yet, in spite of the fact that a lot of the research, as we'll discuss, does not support a clear relationship between saturated fat and heart disease. The American Heart Association is still sticking to their guns on that one. And they just published this article suggesting that coconut oil, despite all of the hype and popularity around it in the recent years, is dangerous and is going to increase our risk of heart disease. And this made quite a big splash, but unfortunately, it's not really based on solid science.
Yeah, why do you think this is that they're willing to update their recommendations on some of what they're saying, and other things they just remain totally, steadfast on? Why do they pick and choose like that?
Well, it depends which way you want to look at it. Upton Sinclair famously said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary is dependent upon him not understanding it." So there are some real potential conflicts of interest, vegetable, industrial seed oil lobby and financial interests in the dietary guidelines remaining as they currently are. So that's one factor. Another is that these I don't necessarily think it's a big conspiracy theory. I just think uh, it takes a long time for organizations like this to shift their public recommendations. I mean, if the AHA comes out and says everything we said about cholesterol and saturated fat is not true, then what credibility are they going to have with other recommendations that they're making? And that's actually a real concern from a public health perspective, because heart disease is the #1 cause of death in this country. And I think they're probably concerned with rightfully so, with people complying with their recommendations. And if they say that their recommendations have been incorrect, then what are the chances that people are going to go on complying with their future recommendations? So I think there are a lot of different factors to consider.
So for people that, coconut oil is their long lost savior, they use it in their hair, their skin, maybe they blend it in their protein shakes, they cook their eggs in it.
Right.
Should we exercise any type of caution with the amount we take in coconut oil, or is it just too much, too soon coming from the AHA, and we just should live our lives the way we continue to live them?
That's a good question. I think there are a couple ways to answer it, actually. So first would be what the research generally says about saturated fat and coconut oil and their relationship or lack of relationship to heart disease. And I want to cover that in some detail. The second question, though, which arguably is an even bigger question, is should we be making nutritional recommendations that apply to everybody across the board? I would argue that we shouldn't be, and that we actually have to customize nutritional recommendations to make them effective. And we're beginning to understand now that there really is no one size fits all approach to diet. And it's, people with certain genetic and epigenetic predispositions might do really well on a diet that's high in saturated fat, including coconut oil, whereas other people with different genetic and epigenetic predispositions might actually do better with a little bit less saturated fat. And I think in 10 years and 20 years, we're going to look back on this period of time where we just made blanket diet recommendations as kind of a foolish exercise, or at least one that was uninformed and not consistent with what we now know about genetics and epigenetics and how they influence dietary needs in each individual person. So that's a whole nother topic. Maybe we'll have a different show on that, but let's talk a little bit about the general research here, because the AHA used only 4 studies in their report to evaluate the safety of saturated fat, but there have been at least 17 systematic reviews and meta-analyses conducted over recent years that did not find a clear link between saturated fat and cholesterol and heart disease. So why they chose those 4 core studies that were in fact from 1969, 1970, 1968, and 1979, instead of the more recent systematic reviews and meta-analyses is not clear. They explained, they deemed the ones that they chose to be the most well-performed, but that is certainly debatable. As I point out in an article that I wrote about this. So that's one issue, is just cherry picking data that supports the conclusion that they want to make. Another is that the American Heart Association, a lot of the studies that they take into account are not necessarily looking at the most important endpoint, which is heart attack. Instead, they're often looking at cholesterol, and they're assuming that if saturated fat intake leads to higher cholesterol, then it must therefore cause heart attacks. Unfortunately, that's not really a safe assumption, because we have actually very large studies that have looked directly at the relationship between saturated fat and heart disease without using cholesterol as an intermediate marker. For example, there's a large meta-analysis of prospective studies involving 350,000 participants that found no association between saturated fat and heart attacks. And in a Japanese study of almost 60,000 men, they not only found no association between saturated fat and heart attack, they actually found an inverse association between saturated fat and stroke, which means that people who ate more saturated fat actually had lower risk of stroke in those studies. A third issue is that some of the studies on saturated and cholesterol and heart disease are done in rodents and in other primates. And the problem with that is that even with non-human primates, the dietary fat and cholesterol metabolism is really different and doesn't necessarily extend to humans. So we can't look at results from animal studies and assume that those are going to that's going to happen in the same way in humans. And then finally, if we look at the we can look at some studies on the Paleolithic diet and its relationship to lipid profiles and cardiovascular disease risk. So we know that for 66,000 generations, our hunter-gatherer ancestors ate primarily meat and fish, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy tubers. And we also know that from studying contemporary hunter-gatherers that their rates of heart disease were really low or almost non-existent. And these cultures can get anywhere from 28 to 58% of their fat, of their total calories from fat, and sometimes up to half of that comes from saturated fat. So there are examples like the Maasai in Africa who consume primarily the meat, the milk, and the blood of the cows that they raise. They're a pastoralist culture. And despite high intakes of saturated fat and high intakes of total fat overall, heart disease is almost non-existent in many of these groups. We also have modern studies looking at Paleolithic diet and its effect on lipid profiles and cardiovascular risk factors. And then studies on the ketogenic diet or low carb diet. And there was a very prominent study in the Journal of Nutrition that looked at 6 weeks of ketogenic diet, which is a very high fat, very high saturated fat diet. And total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol levels were unchanged, but the so-called good cholesterol, HDL levels, actually went up. So suffice to say that there are many, many holes and problems with this AHA statement about coconut oil. And then they completely neglected the many studies that suggest that coconut oil can actually improve blood lipid profile, reduces waist circumference, anti-inflammatory, has antimicrobial properties, can improve antioxidant status, and may even protect against Alzheimer's disease. So what I would say is, if we take all of that as a whole, then it's not convincing that generally across the board, saturated fat and coconut oil in the diet are problematic. However, as I said before, there are some situations where certain people may want to limit saturated fat, and if you want, we can go into that a little bit. But that's the general idea.
Right. So, it's crazy to me, and it's something that's always going to change. There's a time where we were told the eggs weren't good for us, and I think it's just always going to be changing. We always have to try to stay informed, and do our own research in at the same time as we're hearing these things come out. Listen to podcasts. Do our own due diligence if we really want to know what's right for our bodies.
Unfortunately, that's the way it is. We can't rely on these government organizations to give us the unvarnished truth, because they often have other motives. And there are tremendous conflicts of interest in many of these organizations, and that's that studies have shown that those conflicts can and do influence recommendations. We know, for example, that research that's industry funded is more likely to yield a positive income, in favor of whoever is funding that research. That's been shown in scientific studies. It's not just conjecture or opinion. That's actually been shown. They've examined trials that were sponsored by industry and compared them to trials that were not sponsored by industry, and they found that, not surprisingly, the industry-sponsored trials are more likely to yield a positive result. We also know that historically, large number of the physicians who are involved in writing the cholesterol guidelines for the National Cholesterol Education Program accept money from pharmaceutical companies and are in many cases advisors to the pharmaceutical companies. We know that representatives from companies like Nestle and Coca-Cola, the Sugar Association, the United Soybean Board, and the U.S. Canola Association all serve on the Industry Nutrition Advisory Panel that's part of the American Health Association. So yeah, these conflicts of interest make a big difference. They do influence the information that we receive. And therefore, as you said, Orlando, if people want to, know what the research actually, the most current research says at this point, the best way to do that is to rely on credible, researchers and writers that are blogging and delivering information outside of those mainstream organizations, at least in many cases.
Yeah, and Chris, speaking of these stilted recommendations, one of the more outrageous statements in that AHA report was that it's okay to deep fry foods as long as it's in a, quote, nice unsaturated vegetable oil. What are your thoughts on that? Is it ever okay to deep fry foods from a health perspective?
That is just one of the most asinine things I've ever heard from a public health organization. It completely ignores basic biochemistry, which if anyone who's studied biochemistry and understands the structure of fats will know that unsaturated fats are highly susceptible to oxidative damage, where the fats become damaged. And we have numerous studies showing that damaged fats can cause a lot of problems. And that's not controversial at all. Even the mainstream health organization, recognize that. And that's why they have universally recommended against trans fat consumption. And guess what? Deep frying is one of the best, fastest ways to damage fats, highly unsaturated fats. So that should be an indicator for anyone who was not totally sure what to make of that statement. That alone, the AHA report, that alone should raise an eyebrow.
Yeah, that sounds like the Canola Oil Association influencing them big time.
Exactly.
Awesome. Yeah. So listeners of the podcast, if you want to go back a couple episodes, we did a whole podcast on this called Coconut Gate. We went deep on an article that Sean here wrote, and it was quite an awesome podcast. But we're going to leave the AHA alone for a little second, and we're going to shift gears because I want to talk to Chris about gut health. Because gut health, as we all know, is very, very important, and it's something that's becoming more aware to people in this day and age. So, Chris, you have an ebook on gut health I saw on your site, and you have some great articles as well. Tell us a little about the research that you've done behind gut health and overall wellness.
Because you say that now we all know that gut health is important, and that's amazing, really, because just 10, 15 years ago, I don't think that was true at all. But now you can't open a newspaper or magazine without seeing articles about the contribution of the gut and the gut microbiota in particular to all kinds of diseases, not just diseases in the gut like IBS or inflammatory bowel disease, but diseases outside the gut like depression and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and skin problems like psoriasis or eczema or hypothyroidism or hormone issues, or pretty much at this point, it's seeming like there isn't really a condition that a modern disease that we're aware of that isn't influenced in some way by the gut. And that makes sense when you think about it, because the gut is where all of our nutrients and, food is absorbed. And so if our gut health isn't functioning, if our gut health isn't good, we're not going to be able to absorb those nutrients. But we also know now that we harbor that very diverse microbiome, which is bacteria, viruses, yeast, and other organisms that perform a number of different functions, including helping us to absorb foods, but also regulating our immune system and processing nutrients and producing compounds like short-chain fatty acids, which play an important role in our health. So, Hippocrates about 2,500 years ago said all disease begins in the gut. And he didn't have access to any of these modern tools that we have access to now that actually quantify that and show that. But even 2,500 years ago, people knew this. And it's only now that modern science has begun to validate these assumptions and show us that, if you want to protect your health, prevent chronic disease, and extend your lifespan, you've got to be paying attention to the gut.
So let's say we have a guy who has a little indigestion, or he's not digesting his food properly, has bloating and all that. What is your prescription, for a perfect day of eating for him, as far as with the attention to gut health? What food should he be eating during that day to address that?
Well, it always depends. What somebody has access to, how significant the symptoms are. I mean, if someone has those symptoms and they're not already doing a clean, nutrient-dense paleo type of diet, the very first thing I'm going to do is put them on like a 30-day reset, which is where you follow a strict paleo approach for 30 days. and then you see what happens. And in many cases, that alone will resolve 80 to 90% of the digestive symptoms. If that doesn't do it, and that person doesn't have access to a functional medicine practitioner that can do some testing for things like SIBO and other problems that can affect the gut, then the next thing I would probably suggest is that that person follow a low FODMAP version of the paleo diet. And FODMAPs are particular types of carbohydrates that are poorly absorbed in the gut, and they can become food for bacteria that are in the small intestine but shouldn't be. And those bacteria, when they ferment that food, can cause gas and bloating and all of these other telltale symptoms. So reducing your consumption of FODMAPs can be beneficial in addressing some of the symptoms. But the only problem with only doing that over the long term is that those FODMAPs also feed the beneficial bacteria in the colon, which help keep us healthy. So makes some of these dietary changes. They eliminate dairy and grains and a lot of the processed and refined inflammatory foods that characterize the standard American diet, and they still have problems. Then doing some additional testing for things like SIBO, or bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, parasites, fungal overgrowth, and disrupted gut microbiome is really crucial. And that will not only yield benefits for the gut, but it might also prevent the development of some of the other more serious conditions that I mentioned before, like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, that are rapidly, escalating on the list of causes of death and things, and certainly high on the list of things that we want to avoid in our old age.
What are some of those Fodmap carbs exactly? Can you give us a list?
Sure. So FODMAP stands for fructigo, oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monounsaccharides, and polyols. So thankfully we have
Rolls
this
off the
acronym. Yeah. So that describes all the different classes of carbohydrates that we're talking about. So you have fruits that are higher in fructose than glucose, for example, peaches, apples, pineapple includes some of those fruits. And we have fructans, which are found in things like onions and garlic, particularly raw onions and garlic, can be really hard on people with this condition. Polyols or sugar alcohols. So, these are not typically found in foods, but they're found in supplements and things like that. Sometimes people with diabetes and other issues use sugar alcohols because they're non-caloric sweeteners. So that's something to be aware of. And then, some lactose, for example, would be another FODMAP that many people can't tolerate. So those are some examples. And if you just go on Google and you search for low FODMAP diet, there's lots of different handouts and resources available, and as well as in my gut ebook.
Cool. What are some of the superfoods that you can use to help heal?
Bone broth, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about recently, and that's definitely high on the list because it contains a lot of glycine, which is a protein that's involved in it's a major constituent of the cells of the gut themselves, the tissues and cells of the gut. So it helps rebuild your gut tissues and your gut barrier. Probiotics, either in food, which is, I think, the preferred way of getting them. So things like yogurt or kefir, which is a more liquid form of yogurt, raw sauerkraut, not the kind that people put on their hot dogs in this country, which is pasteurized, but the raw sauerkraut you have to get, if it's not in the refrigerator section of the store, it's not raw. And because when you pasteurize it, it kills the bacteria, which is what you're trying to get from it in the first place. Kimchi is a Korean condiment, also has a lot of beneficial bacteria. Kombucha. So there are more and more, you walk into any health food store now, there's more and more of these fermented foods available. And then fermentable carbohydrates. So I mentioned that FODMAPs can be a problem for some people, and some people may need to cut back on those. But for those that do tolerate them, they're actually good for the beneficial bacteria. Then you have soluble fibers. That's found in a lot of fruits and vegetables and starchy tubers like sweet potatoes, for example. And then you have resistant starches that can be found in things like, if people are eating these and tolerate them, like legumes, lentils, cooked and cooled rice and potatoes. So there are a lot of ways that you can get these prebiotics, which actually feed the beneficial bacteria that are already in your gut. And then, of course, if all of that's not doing the trick, then you can consider supplementing with probiotics and prebiotics.
Cool. So I was also reading on your site a little bit about gluten and the relationship there, because even for non-celiacs, gluten can be an issue.
That's right. There's been this misconception for many years that only celiacs suffer from gluten intolerance, and that we frankly just know that that's not true. Now there's a condition called non-celiac gluten sensitivity or non-celiac wheat sensitivity. It's been validated in the clinical research. I've written several articles about this. I don't understand at this point why people are still in denial that this exists, because the research is overwhelming. And yet you still see popular media articles making fun of people with gluten who say they're gluten intolerant, and it's just really ridiculous in my opinion, because there's not really a controversy. And the thing is, non-celiac gluten sensitivity can cause problems that are arguably as serious as celiac disease, including ataxia, which is a form of paralysis, a wide range of neurological and cognitive and behavioral disorders, can contribute to things like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, can cause skin issues like dermatitis. It can cause neurodegeneration and potentially lead to conditions like we've been discussing all throughout the show. So I don't go as far as some people go and say that everyone should avoid gluten, because I don't believe we really have research to support that. But I will say that gluten intolerance is probably much more common than typically recognized, affecting possibly up to 1 in 10 people. That's the most aggressive estimate I've seen. And I will also say that most of the foods that contain significant amounts of gluten are generally just not great foods to eat anyways, from a nutrient density perspective. We're talking about breads and crackers and cookies and things that just don't really have any benefit for us and can cause harm in a number of other ways. So generally, if you're eating a lot of gluten, you're not doing yourself any favors, whether you're gluten intolerant or not. But certainly, if you have gluten intolerance, that is exacerbated, significantly.
What are some of the first signs that somebody might be gluten intolerant? What would they begin to notice?
That's the really hard thing about it, and I think why we went so long before we started figuring this out is the symptoms are very nonspecific. So for one person, it could be diarrhea and gas and bloating every time they eat gluten. For another person, they might not even have any gut symptoms. In fact, in 30% of cases of celiac disease, and some studies suggest up to 50%, it's what they call silent, which means it doesn't produce any of the classic gut symptoms that you expect, and instead will manifest as brain fog or some kind of neurodegenerative condition or a skin condition like dermatitis or psoriasis or eczema. And so you get the typical patient who goes into the doctor and says, I'm tired, I've got these skin problems. They might mention brain fog, and the doctor is not immediately thinking gluten, because it doesn't fit the standard picture of a patient having celiac disease. And so I think a lot of times it's missed for that reason.
Wow, awesome. So, we're just about out of time here. We'd love to talk longer, but you got to go. You got a trip coming up. So before we go, I'd love if you could offer a tip for total human optimization. If you could offer one tip, what would that be?
Um, One tip would be paying attention. And what I mean by that is developing the ability to focus your attention in a meaningful way. And meditation is a really fantastic tool for this. But one of my teachers used to say, the quality of our experience is determined by the focus of our attention. And if we don't know how to focus our attention, then we're not going to be very good at life, essentially, is what it comes down to. So took me many years to fully get my head around that. But at this point, I see that as one of the most overlooked and important we can cultivate.